At my WIFES baby shower, I was denied entry. You won't believe what happened next. You won't believe what happened at my wife's baby shower. One moment I thought I was just another guest, and the next, I was left standing outside in disbelief. But that's not where the story ends. What I did next changed everything. Stick around, because by the end of this, you'll never look at betrayal the same way again. I had to make a choice. Would I let their laughter and whispers break me? Or would I find a way to turn the tables? What would you do if you were in my shoes? Comment 1 if you think I'll walk away and let it go. Or comment woo 2 foot if you think I'm about to teach them all a lesson. I never thought I'd find myself standing outside a venue like this, hesitating at the entrance, my pulse thumping in my ears. The baby shower wasn't supposed to be my scene. I knew that from the start, but Isabel had insisted, practically begging me to show up for appearances. Ironic, since my very appearance seemed to cause her so much embarrassment. The air outside was crisp and cool, a late October evening that carried the scent of leaves just beginning to decay. I'd have much rather been home, perfecting a new sauce, or even mindlessly chopping vegetables in the calm of my own kitchen. But no, here I was, staring at a set of polished double doors that glowed with the promise of opulence inside. She had always loved the grand gestures. That was Isabel's world, the chandeliers, the silver platters, the designer dresses that looked more like they belonged in a museum than on a person. I had met her when I was just starting out in the culinary world, still dreaming of opening my own place, still naive enough to believe that hard work and passion were all it took. Back then, her charm, her energy, her effortless way of commanding a room had been intoxicating. But the longer we were together, the more I started to notice the cracks. She was less interested in who I was, and more interested in how I made her look. And as my career kept me tucked away in kitchens, far from the spotlight, Isabel's disdain began to seep through in little comments, little dismissals, until it was impossible to ignore. I knew tonight would be no different. I braced myself, took a breath, and walked in. The warmth hit me first, along with the hum of expensive chatter, the gentle clinking of glasses, and the kind of soft, ambient music that seemed specifically chosen to remind you of how much money was being spent. No one turned as I entered. No one greeted me. I was just another moving shape at the periphery of their glittering little world. I scanned the room, my eyes catching the sparkle of a massive chandelier above a long, elegantly set table. Pastel floral arrangements adorned every corner, the kind that must have cost a small fortune, but looked like they'd be thrown away by morning. I saw her then, standing in a cluster of women. She was radiant as always, her blonde hair cascading over her shoulders, her custom-made maternity dress hugging her in all the right places. Isabel had a way of turning heads. She didn't need to do much, just stand there, smile, and tilt her head slightly, as if everything she said was both profound and charming. The crowd around her was hanging on her every word, laughing when she laughed, nodding when she nodded. She didn't see me at first. Or maybe she did and just chose not to acknowledge me. I moved further in, my shoes echoing softly on the marble floor. A few heads turned then, but the glances were fleeting, disinterested. The hostess at the entrance hadn't even looked me in the eye when I showed her the invitation. I wasn't anyone important. I wasn't anyone they needed to impress. The name cards on the table confirmed it. Every place had been carefully labeled in flowing script: Miss Evelyn Bradford, Dr. Samuel Hayes, Mrs. Caroline Morton, and so on. Each seat reserved for someone of importance, someone who mattered in Isabel's social circles. My name was nowhere to be found. I didn't need to be told. I knew at the moment I saw the table that there was no place for me here. Not just physically, there was no name card with John Spencer scrawled in elegant letters, but figuratively, emotionally, in every possible way. This wasn't my world. This was hers. And the more I stood there, the clearer it became that I was an outsider in my own marriage. It wasn't the first time I'd felt it. But tonight it hit differently. It wasn't just a passing comment at a dinner party, or a dismissive glance when I mentioned my work. Tonight, it was a room full of strangers who all seemed to know exactly where I belonged, and it wasn't here. I saw Isabel catch my eye then. Her face lit up in a smile. One of those polished, practiced smiles she used when she needed to look good. She excused herself from the group and walked toward me, her heels clicking against the floor, her dress flowing elegantly around her. "Oh, you made it," she said, her tone high and cheerful, as if I'd wandered in off the street and she was just being gracious. "I didn't think you'd come." I opened my mouth to reply, but she barreled on, barely pausing to breathe. "It's just. We had so many guests RSVP at the last minute. And, well, you know how these things are. There's no seat left. I hope that's okay. I'm sure you don't mind standing for a bit." I looked at her, really looked at her, trying to read what was behind that smile. Did she realize what she was saying? Did she care? Her friends were still gathered behind her, glancing our way, whispering, laughing softly. One of them caught my eye, then quickly looked away, hiding her smirk behind a champagne flute. "No seat?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "Oh, why don't you pop over to that little pub across the street?" she said, waving her hand dismissively. "You know the one. It's cozy, more your style." My hands tightened into fists at my sides, but I didn't react. I didn't say a word. I just nodded, turned, and walked out the way I came. Their laughter followed me as I left, echoing in my ears long after I stepped outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and I stood there for a moment, breathing it in, trying to push down the anger that threatened to boil over. I looked back at the glowing venue, its windows framed by golden light. Inside, they were probably still laughing, still sipping champagne, still basking in their own importance. But I wasn't going to let them have the last word. They didn't know who I was. They didn't know what I was capable of. And as I turned and started walking across the street toward the Copper Spoon, I felt the first spark of something I hadn't felt in years: purpose. When I crossed the street and stepped into the Copper Spoon, I could feel the weight of the evening still clinging to me. The humiliation, the laughter, Isabel's dismissive smile, all of it replayed in my mind as I pushed open the door and was greeted by the familiar hum of my restaurant. The warmth from the kitchen hit me first, along with the soft chatter of diners, and the faint sound of clinking glassware. The aroma of roasted garlic and fresh herbs wrapped around me like a safety net, pulling me away from the cold memory of that chandelier-lit room. This place was mine. Every scratch on the polished wood floors, every neatly folded napkin, every flicker of candlelight on the tables. I had built it all, yet as I stood there, something felt off. Even here, surrounded by the proof of my efforts, I couldn't shake the words she had said. "It suits you perfectly." The way she and her friends had laughed, as if this place was a punchline, burned in the back of my mind. I had spent years pouring myself into this restaurant, and it was still just a pub to her. I shook it off, and moved toward the kitchen. The staff was in full swing, their movements precise and synchronized. The sound of knives against cutting boards blending with the steady rhythm of orders being called out. They acknowledged me with nods, but their focus remained on the dishes in front of them. That was how I wanted it. My role wasn't to command attention. It was to set the tone, to guide them from the background, ensuring every plate that left the pass was flawless. Tonight, the first needed that rhythm. I needed to drown out the voices in my head with the sound of my own work. One stepped up to the pass and scanned the tickets. The orders were flowing steadily: seared duck breast with a red wine reduction, pan-roasted sea bass with fennel and citrus, hand-cut pappardelle and a wild mushroom rag. Each dish was a small piece of the puzzle that made up the Copper Spoon's reputation. But no matter how well the night went, I couldn't stop thinking about Isabel and her friends, their laughter cutting through the memory of every accomplishment. The kitchen was a sanctuary, but tonight, it didn't feel like enough. As I plated a dish and handed it off to a server, my mind kept drifting. I thought back to when I first opened this place, when Isabel had been supportive, or at least, when I thought she was. I had worked double shifts at another restaurant, saving every spare dollar to buy the equipment, to cover the rent. I remember the late nights of painting walls, sanding down the counters, choosing the right light fixtures. Isabel had come by occasionally, offering her input on the decor, smiling as she ran her fingers over the sample menus. I'd laid out. Back then, I thought it was our dream, but over time, it became clear that it wasn't hers. She wasn't interested in what I was creating. She was interested in what it could do for her image. As the years went on, her visits became less frequent. She stopped asking how the restaurant was doing. When I'd tell her about a busy night, about the new sous chef I'd hired, about a particularly great review we'd received. She'd nod politely, maybe murmur, "That's nice," before turning the conversation back to herself. It wasn't long before she stopped coming altogether. And tonight, that indifference had turned into outright scorn. I kept my hands busy, checking on the sauces, adjusting the plating of the duck, tasting the beurre blanc for balance. I moved from station to station, offering a suggestion here, a correction there. The staff worked like a well-oiled machine, but my mind was stuck in the past, replaying every moment that had led to tonight. The first time she called it a hobby. The first time she rolled her eyes when I talked about expanding the menu. The time she brought her friends here and acted like she barely knew me, introducing me as the chef instead of her husband. Those moments had piled up over the years, but I had pushed them aside, focused on the work, on building something real. Tonight, though, it all came crashing down. A server approached me with a question about a wine pairing, pulling me out of my thoughts. I answered quickly, and as they walked away, I caught my reflection in the stainless steel of the prep station. I looked tired, older than I felt, with lines around my eyes that hadn't been there a few years ago. I wiped my hands on my apron and took a deep breath. This was my place. It wasn't just a pub. It wasn't just a side project. It was a piece of who I was, and Isabel didn't get to take that away from me. I turned my attention back to the tickets, forcing myself to focus. Another order came in 4 top, 2 steaks, a vegetarian risotto, and the sea bass again. I barked out the order, and the kitchen came alive. The sizzle of meat hitting the grill, the sharp tap of a knife against a board, the low hum of a sauce bubbling on the stove, it was all part of the rhythm that kept me grounded. As I worked, the voices from earlier began to fade. Not completely, but enough. Each perfectly seared piece of fish, each beautifully plated dish, was a small act of defiance against the laughter that still echoed in my ears. And then, as I moved through the kitchen, checking on each station, something shifted. A moment of clarity. I realized that I didn't need to prove anything to Isabel or her friends. I didn't need to explain why this place mattered. I had spent years letting their opinions creep into my head, letting their judgment dictate how I felt about my work. But now, standing in the middle of my kitchen, surrounded by the team I had built, the restaurant I had created, I saw it for what it was. Theirs wasn't the world I wanted to be part of. I didn't need their approval. This was my world, my sanctuary. As the dinner rush continued, I found my rhythm again. The tension in my chest eased with each plate that left the pass. The staff worked seamlessly. The diners were happy. And for the first time that evening, I felt like myself. The laughter from that elegant room, the whispers about the chef, Isabel's patronizing smile, they all started to fade, replaced by the steady hum of my kitchen, the warmth of the stoves, the satisfaction of seeing my team thrive. By the time the last ticket came in, I was back in control. I finished the plating, called out the order, and stepped back. The kitchen began to wind down, the frenetic energy settling into a quieter rhythm. I looked around at my team, at the space I had built from the ground up. This was what mattered. Not the chandeliers, or the pastel floral arrangements, or the laughter of people who would never understand. This was real. This was mine. The night wasn't over, not by a long shot, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let her, or anyone else, define my worth. The Copper Spoon was more than a restaurant. It was proof that I could create something meaningful, something lasting, no matter what anyone else thought. And as I walked to the front of the house to thank the servers, to greet a few of the regulars on their way out, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not in spite of Isabel and her friends, but because of what I had done, what I had built. This place wasn't for them. It never was. It was for me, and for the people who truly valued what went into it. And that was enough. I had to make a choice. Would I let their laughter and whispers break me, or would I find a way to turn the tables? What would you do if you were in my shoes? Comment 1-1 if you think I'll walk away and let it go. Or comment woo 2-2 fut if you think I'm about to teach them all a lesson. When I got home that night, the stillness hit me like a cold wind. I walked into the kitchen, turned on a single overhead light, and set my keys down on the counter. For a while, I just stood there, hands on the edge of the counter, staring down at the dark granite surface. The memory of their laughter still echoed in my head. I could hear Isabel's voice, so sweetly dismissive, practically waving me off like I was the hired help. I clenched my fists, my knuckles pressing into the counter until they turned white. The kitchen was my safe place, the one space where I had always felt in control. But tonight, it didn't feel like that. The air in the room seemed heavier, the silence pressing down on me. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like cooking. I didn't want to chop vegetables, whisk sauces, or sear a single steak. I just stood there, letting the frustration and humiliation simmer under my skin. Isabel had always been good at making me feel small. She never shouted or argued. That wasn't her style. Instead, she used little comments, tiny barbs that worked their way under my skin. "Oh, it's just a pub," she'd say, waving off my hours of prep work, my late nights balancing payroll, my constant focus on the menu. "That place is so quaint." She loved that word, quaint. It sounded harmless, almost polite, but I knew what it really meant: small, unimpressive, unimportant. And it wasn't just her. Her friends were even worse. They didn't even bother pretending to be polite. When I overheard them talking, I heard the word chef said with the kind of disdain you'd reserve for someone who didn't belong in their world. I pushed away from the counter and walked into the living room. It was too quiet in here. The house felt hollow, like it didn't belong to me anymore. The framed photos on the mantel, the elegant rugs, the perfectly arranged throw pillows, all of it was Isabel's doing. I had never cared much for decorating, so I let her handle it. Now, as I looked around, I realized I didn't even recognize the place. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a showroom, something to be displayed rather than lived in. And that made me angry. Not just at her, but at myself. I had let it happen. I had stepped back, stayed quiet, told myself it didn't matter. I focused on the restaurant, telling myself that was where I belonged. But that silence, that willingness to step aside, had left me standing here, a stranger in my own house, with no one but myself to blame. I walked over to the mantel and picked up one of the photos. It was from our wedding day. Isabel looked radiant, her white dress flowing like a cloud, her smile wide and genuine. I remembered that day so clearly, the excitement, the hope, the feeling that we were starting something incredible together. I had loved her, deeply, with every part of myself. But somewhere along the way, we had drifted. Or rather, she had drifted, and I had been too busy trying to make the restaurant work to notice. By the time I realized how far apart we'd grown, it was too late. She had her world, and I had mine. And instead of fighting for her, I just let it happen. I told myself it was fine, that as long as the restaurant was successful, everything else would fall into place. But now I was starting to see the truth. The restaurant had become my refuge, because I didn't know how to fix what was broken between us. I had poured myself into it, trying to create something meaningful. Something that would prove I wasn't just a guy cooking burgers in a back room. But Isabel never saw it that way. To her, it was just a hobby, a distraction. She couldn't see the late nights, the double shifts, the endless paperwork. All she saw was a man in an apron, someone who didn't fit into her world of cocktail parties and charity galas. And for years, I let that sting. I let it hurt me. But tonight, standing there in the empty house, staring at that wedding photo, something shifted. I set the photo back on the mantel and stood there for a long moment. My anger wasn't just at Isabel. It wasn't just at her friends or their laughter. It was at myself. For years, I had been waiting for her approval, waiting for her to see the value in what I was doing. I wanted her to be proud of me, to see the restaurant as a reflection of my hard work, my passion. But that was never going to happen. She didn't understand what the restaurant meant to me, and she never would. And that realization hurt more than anything she or her friends could say. But as the minutes ticked by, that hurt began to change. It began to harden into something else. Determination. For the first time, I realized that I didn't need her approval. I didn't need anyone's approval. The restaurant wasn't just a place I worked. It wasn't just a job. It was my creation, my dream. And whether Isabel saw it or not, whether anyone saw it or not, it was real. I thought about the customers who came back week after week, the regulars who knew me by name, the new diners who left glowing reviews. They didn't care about cocktail parties or designer dresses. They cared about the food, the experience, the heart that went into every dish. And that was what mattered. I walked back into the kitchen and turned on the stove. I grabbed a cutting board, pulled a few vegetables from the fridge, and started chopping. The sound of the knife hitting the board was steady, rhythmic, grounding. I didn't have a plan. I just needed to do something, to remind myself why I had started this journey in the first place. The ingredients piled up: onions, garlic, carrots, celery. I reached for a bottle of olive oil, drizzled it into a pan, and tossed in the onions. The sizzle was like a bomb, cutting through the fog in my head. As I worked, I started to remember the early days. The excitement of finding the perfect space, the pride I felt when we hung the sign over the door, the rush of that first dinner service, when every table was full. I remembered the regular who always ordered the sea bass, the couple who celebrated their anniversary with us every year, the little boy who said my risotto was the best thing he'd ever tasted. Those were the moments that mattered. Not the comments from Isabel's friends, not the snide remarks or the laughter. This kitchen, this work, it was who I was. The onions caramelized, their sweetness filling the air. I added the garlic, then the carrots and celery. I deglazed the pan with white wine, letting the steam rise and carry away the last traces of self-doubt. I seasoned the mixture, tasted it, adjusted it. I worked without thinking, letting my hands guide me, letting the process remind me of what I was capable of. This was my world. This was where I belonged, and no one could take that away from me. By the time the dish was finished, I felt lighter. Not happy, not yet, but steadier. The laughter from earlier still lingered, but it felt distant now, like a bad dream that fades as the day goes on. I plated the food, sat down at the counter, and took a bite. The flavors were bright, balanced, alive. For the first time that night, I felt a small flicker of pride. Not because of Isabel, not because of what she thought or didn't think, but because of the work one had done, the work that had always been enough. The next day, I found myself back in the restaurant, still thinking about the night before. The kitchen buzzed with activity as the lunch crowd came and went, but I couldn't stop replaying those moments in my head. It wasn't just Isabel's words that stayed with me. It was the look in her eyes. That subtle, practiced detachment. She had never needed to say much. Everything was right there in her expression. She didn't think this place mattered. But as I stood at the pass, watching plate after plate leave the kitchen, I felt a resolve I hadn't felt in a long time. If Isabel couldn't see the value in what I was building here, then I would make it so undeniable that even she would have to stop and take notice. I shifted my focus to the food. That's where I had always found my footing, where I could push everything else out of my mind. I thought about the menu, about how every dish had a story behind it. The roasted duck breast was more than just a protein. It was something I'd perfected over years of trial and error, tweaking the brine, adjusting the cook time, refining the glaze until it hit just the right balance of sweet and savory. The handmade pappardelle wasn't just pasta. It was hours of rolling, cutting, and shaping, making sure each ribbon was thin enough to hold the sauce, but sturdy enough to keep its integrity on the plate. I poured everything I had into these dishes, and every time one came back to the kitchen empty, it felt like a small victory. That afternoon, I decided it was time to step things up. The Copper Spoon had always been a neighborhood spot, intimate, approachable, quietly respected by those who knew it, but now I wanted to make a bigger statement. I didn't want to rely on reputation alone. I wanted to push the boundaries of what we could do. I started with the menu. I brought in seasonal ingredients, sourcing from local farms, experimenting with flavor combinations I'd never tried before. I wanted every bite to be a revelation, something that made people stop mid-conversation and take notice. The team picked up on my energy. I didn't have to spell it out for them, they could feel the shift. My sous chef, Mike, who'd been with me from the beginning, gave me a knowing look as I worked alongside him on the line. "You've got that look in your eye again," he said with a smirk, tossing a handful of julienne carrots into a pan. I didn't respond. I just nodded and kept my head down, focused on the work. As the weeks went on, the changes started to show. The dishes became more refined, more thoughtful. The guests noticed too. I could see it in their faces as they took that first bite, their eyes widening just slightly, their forks pausing for a moment before diving back in. And the reviews started to trickle in local food blogs, community papers, even a mention in a regional dining magazine. They talked about the attention to detail, the surprising flavor profiles, the sense of care that came through in every plate. But I knew I couldn't stop there. If I was going to prove that the Copper Spoon was more than just a pub, I needed to reach beyond the walls of my kitchen. I reached out to local farmers and producers, inviting them to the restaurant to showcase their products. I partnered with a nearby brewery to create custom pairings for our tasting menu. I wanted to turn the Copper Spoon into something bigger than just a place to eat. I wanted it to be an experience, a destination. The staff rallied around the new vision. The servers took extra care to explain the dishes, sharing stories about the ingredients and the inspiration behind them. The kitchen crew worked longer hours, experimenting with techniques, fine-tuning recipes, pushing themselves in ways they hadn't before. And slowly, the restaurant started to change. It still had the same charm, the same warmth that had drawn in regulars for years. But now there was something more, a sense of ambition, of purpose. One evening, as the dinner rush began to wind down, I stepped out into the dining room. It wasn't something I did often. I preferred to stay in the kitchen, where I could focus on the food. But tonight, I wanted to see the reactions firsthand. I moved through the tables quietly, nodding at familiar faces, pausing to ask how they were enjoying their meal. The feedback was immediate. People smiled, raised their glasses, complimented the new dishes. It was all positive, but it wasn't enough. I needed more. I needed to hear that this place wasn't just good, it was exceptional. I made my way back to the kitchen, the adrenaline still coursing through me. Mike gave me a thumbs up as I passed, and one of the line cooks called out, "Chef, we're good on tickets. The last round is plating now." I nodded, but my mind was already racing ahead. I wasn't content to coast on the momentum. I wanted to keep pushing, to keep building on what we'd started. I wanted to make the Copper Spoon a name people remembered, a place they talked about long after their meal was over. As the night came to a close, I sat in my office, scrolling through the reservation list for the next few weeks. It was nearly full, a sign that the changes were working. But I didn't feel satisfied, not yet. There was still more to do, more to prove. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how far we'd come and how much further I wanted to go. I knew it wouldn't be easy. It never was. But if there was one thing I'd learned over the years, it was that success wasn't about waiting for someone else's approval. It was about putting in the work, day after day, plate after plate, until the results spoke for themselves. And that was exactly what I intended to do. In the weeks that followed, the kitchen became more than a place of work. It became my battlefield. Every dish that left the pass was another move in a game I hadn't known I was playing until Isabel and her friends forced me to see it. I started arriving earlier, before the sun came up, and staying later, long after the dining room had emptied. There was no room for distractions. The faint echo of Isabel's voice, the smirks of her friends, those had no place here. Here, it was just me, my team, and the food. I let the rhythm of the kitchen drown out the noise in my head. The sharp clack of a knife on a cutting board, the sizzle of oil in a hot pan, the low murmur of my sous chef calling out orders, those sounds became my armor. But I wasn't just cooking, I was refining. Every ingredient that came through the back door was inspected, questioned, tested. I wanted perfection. I started experimenting in the off hours, testing new techniques and tweaking old recipes. The duck wasn't just duck anymore, it was a process. I tested dry aging times, adjusted the spice rub, and played with smoking it over different types of wood. I turned my attention to sauces, trying different reductions, adding unexpected ingredients like tamarind or cocoa nibs to find that extra layer of complexity. Every detail mattered. If a dish didn't make me pause and think, that's it didn't go on the menu. The team caught on to the change in pace. My sous chef, Mike, would give me a raised eyebrow and a half smile when I tossed out another round of "what if we tried this?" moments. But he never questioned it. He trusted the process. The line cooks picked up on the energy, too. There were more conversations about plating, about timing. We found a groove. Even the servers noticed the difference. They began talking about the food with a confidence they hadn't shown before, weaving stories into their tableside presentations. Suddenly, the Copper Spoon wasn't just a restaurant, it was an experience. At first, the changes felt subtle, like the steady chipping away of a rough stone. But soon, the results started to show. Guests began asking more questions about the dishes. How do you get the duck to taste like that? They'd say, or what's that ingredient in the sauce? I've never tasted anything like it. The answers weren't simple, but that was the point. I wanted people to notice the effort, to feel it in every bite. I wanted them to know that this wasn't just thrown together, it was crafted. And then, something happened that took me by surprise. One of Isabel's friends came in. Not her closest circle, this was someone on the outer edges. Someone who knew her but wasn't part of that inner sanctum of judgment. She sat at a table by the window, flipping through the menu with what looked like mild interest. I recognized her, but I didn't say anything. I kept my head down, stayed focused on the food. When her first course went out, I watched from the kitchen. I saw her take that first bite, pause, and look up at the server as if to ask, "Is this for real?" She finished every bite, ordered the next course, and then a dessert. The next day, we got a call. She wanted to book a private dinner, a special event for her company. When the reservation came in, I stared at the computer screen for a long time. This wasn't just a dinner party. This was a chance to show Isabel's world at least a part of it, what I'd been doing all this time. I didn't tell the staff about the connection. I didn't want them distracted. We prepared like we always did, focusing on the details, making sure everything was just right. When the night of the event arrived, I stayed in the kitchen. I let the servers handle the room, the wine pairings, the introductions. I stayed behind the pass, watching the dishes go out one by one, listening to the steady hum of the restaurant. And then I heard it. Applause. I hadn't realized how tense I'd been until that moment. My shoulders relaxed just slightly as I listened to the sound. Faint, but unmistakable. They were clapping for the food, for the experience. For us. Later that evening, as the event wound down and the guests began to leave, the organizer Isabel's friend asked to see me. I wiped my hands, adjusted my apron, and stepped out into the dining room. She stood near the door, holding her coat, her face softened by what I could only describe as genuine appreciation. "You're the chef?" she asked, her voice warm. "I am," I replied, keeping my tone steady. "That was extraordinary," she said. "I had no idea this place was like this." "Thank you," I said simply, though my heart was pounding. She shook my hand and smiled, a genuine smile that felt worlds away from the smirks I'd seen at Isabel's party. "You've got something special here. I'll be back." When she walked out the door, I stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. I thought about what she'd said, about how the food had spoken for itself. It wasn't about proving anything to Isabel or her friends anymore. It was about showing myself that this place, this work, was worth every ounce of effort I'd put into it. As I turned back toward the kitchen, the weight of the past few weeks began to lift. I felt a small, hard-won sense of pride. It wasn't about redemption. It was about recognition. Not from Isabel. Not from her circle. But from the people who sat at those tables. Who tasted the food. Who understood what it meant. Back in the kitchen, the staff was cleaning up. The steady rhythm of clattering plates and running water filling the space. I stepped up to the pass and looked around. It wasn't just a kitchen anymore. It was the heart of something much bigger. I didn't need Isabel to see it. I didn't need her friends to admit it. I knew it. We all knew it. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. One evening, not long after that dinner event, I found myself standing by the back door of the restaurant, staring out into the dark alley, as the last of the staff cleaned up. The sound of plates clinking in the dish pit, and the low hum of the dishwasher, were faint in the background. The alley smelled of damp asphalt, and the faint whiff of discarded produce from the neighboring shops. But I didn't mind. This was the moment of quiet I'd come to rely on, the pause before the long walk home, where I could let the rush of the evening settle and think about what was next. That night, though, my thoughts weren't on the usual inventory lists or upcoming menu changes. My thoughts kept circling back to Isabel, her dismissive smile, and the way her friend had left that private dinner event looking genuinely impressed. A part of me knew it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter whether her friend liked the food, whether she walked away with a new perspective. But deep down, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of vindication. The laughter from Isabel's baby shower was still fresh in my memory, as was her condescending tone when she suggested the pub across the street. They had underestimated me, all of them. and though I wasn't looking for revenge, I couldn't deny that it felt good to know that at least one of them had seen what I had built. Still, it wasn't enough. I closed the door and walked back into the kitchen. The crew was just about done for the night, the countertops gleaming and the floor freshly mopped. "Good work, everyone," I said, my voice steady. A few nodded, their faces tired but content. I watched them filter out one by one, offering a good night, chef, as they left. When the last of them was gone, I turned out the lights and stepped out into the cool evening air. The streets were quiet as I made my way home. I passed the same shops, the same cafes, the same bars I'd walked by countless times. The neon sign of the late-night diner glowed faintly in the distance, and the rhythmic sound of my footsteps against the pavement echoed in the stillness. But as I walked, something felt different. The weight I'd been carrying for so long felt lighter, as if some part of me had shifted. For the first time in years, I felt like I was walking towards something rather than just going through the motions. When I reached my apartment, I tossed my keys on the counter and went straight to the fridge. I pulled out a bottle of water and leaned against the counter, taking a long drink as I stared out the kitchen window. The city lights shimmered in the distance, the muted sounds of traffic drifting up from the street below. I thought about the day I signed the lease for the Copper Spoon. How full of hope I'd been. How certain I was that I could create something lasting. Something meaningful. Back then, I'd believed that if I worked hard enough, it would all come together. I'd believed that Isabel would see the effort, the passion, and that she'd be proud. But that pride never came. Instead, her words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. Even after all this time, I still heard her voice in my head, diminishing my work, questioning my choices. I had spent so long trying to prove her wrong, trying to show her that the Copper Spoon was more than just a pub. And now, standing alone in my quiet kitchen, I realized something. I didn't need her to see it. I didn't need her approval. I never had. I set the bottle down and turned off the kitchen light. As I stood in the darkness, the city's glow casting faint shadows on the walls, I felt a sense of clarity. I wasn't building the Copper Spoon for Isabel, or for her friends, or even for the critics who had started to take notice. I was building it for me. For the people who walked through the door each night, looking for a meal that could brighten their day, a moment of comfort, a taste of something genuine. I made my way to the living room, sinking into the old leather armchair by the window. The soft creak of the chair as I sat down felt oddly comforting. I leaned back, staring out at the skyline, and let myself think about what lay ahead. The Copper Spoon had already come so far, but I knew there was more to do. I could feel it. There were more flavors to discover, more guests to wow, more stories to tell through the food. The following morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. I got to the restaurant early, before the sun was fully up, and spent some time walking the empty dining room. The wooden tables, the neatly folded napkins, the subtle glow of the morning light filtering through the front windows, it all felt like a clean slate. I stepped into the kitchen and began preparing for the day, my hands moving with confidence. There was no hesitation now, no doubt. I knew what needed to be done. As the day progressed, I watched the restaurant come to life. The staff moved with precision. The dishes left the kitchen looking more refined than ever. And the guests seemed more engaged, more connected to what we were creating. I could see it in their expressions, in the way they lingered over their meals, savoring every bite. This was what I'd been working toward all along, not Isabel's approval, not her friends' recognition, but this quiet, steady affirmation that I was on the right path. By the time the dinner service wrapped up that night, I felt more grounded than I had in years. The laughter from Isabel's party, the dismissive comments, the subtle jabs, they were still there, but they no longer held the same power. I had found my footing again, not because anyone told me I was good enough, but because I knew it for myself. The Copper Spoon was mine, and it had become something more than I ever imagined. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The day the review came out, I didn't even know it at first. I was in the kitchen, as usual, focused on prepping for the dinner service. We'd received good reviews before, even a few glowing write-ups in respected food blogs and local papers. But this was different. This one was from one of the most well-known critics in the region, someone whose words could change the course of a restaurant's reputation overnight. But at that moment, I was elbow deep in preparations, more concerned about perfecting a new sauce than scanning the internet for mentions of the copper spoon. It wasn't until Mike, my sous chef, came rushing into the kitchen, a huge grin on his face and his phone in hand, that I realized something big had happened. "Chef, you gotta see this," he said, holding his phone out to me. "You're not gonna believe it." I wiped my hands on a towel and took the phone, glancing down at the screen. My stomach flipped as I saw the headline, "The Copper Spoon, a hidden gem that's redefining fine dining." The critic's name was printed just below a name that carried weight, that people in the industry paid attention to. My eyes scanned the first few paragraphs, and with each sentence, my chest felt tighter, my heart beating faster. Words like sublime, impeccable, masterful jumped out at me. It was more than just praise, it was the kind of review chefs dream about. A declaration that we weren't just good, we were exceptional. For a moment, I stood there, the bustling noise of the kitchen fading into the background. This was it. This was the moment I'd been working toward all those long nights. All those hours of tweaking recipes, refining techniques, and pushing my team to be better than we ever thought we could be. I felt a rush of pride, but it was quickly followed by something else, a sense of vindication. Isabel's voice, that dismissive tone she always used, played in my mind. "It's just a pub," she'd said. "Nobody takes it seriously." But now, here was this critic, a person who mattered in the culinary world, calling my work extraordinary. For years, I'd let Isabel's words cut me down, make me doubt my own worth. But now, I had proof that she was wrong. The team gathered around, their faces lit up with excitement. Mike read aloud snippets from the review, his voice practically trembling with enthusiasm. "The seared duck breast is a revelation," he said, laughing. "Revelation, chef. I mean, come on. They don't write that about just anyone." The line cooks cheered, the dishwasher gave a whoop, and even the normally stoic maitre d' cracked a smile. Everyone felt that this wasn't just a win for me, it was a win for all of us. We'd built this together, and now the world was starting to notice. I wanted to soak in the moment, to let the words of the review wash over me, but the night's service was looming. The tables were about to fill, and we had work to do. "All right," I said, raising my hands to quiet the room. "Let's celebrate later. Right now, we've got diners coming in, and we need to show them why this review matters. Let's make every plate perfect tonight." The energy in the kitchen shifted. It wasn't just a routine dinner service anymore. It was our first chance to live up to the review. The whole team moved with renewed purpose, their confidence palpable. I could feel it, too, a sharp focus, an almost electric determination. The first tickets came in, and we got to work, the kitchen humming with a rhythm that felt effortless yet intense. As the night went on, I couldn't help but think about Isabel. I wondered if she'd seen the review, if one of her friends had texted her a link, or if it had popped up on her social media feed. What would she think? Would she dismiss it, laugh it off, say it didn't matter? Or would she finally, for once, acknowledge that what I'd built wasn't just some passing whim? That it was something real, something worthy of respect? But I didn't have time to dwell on it. The rush was in full swing, and the kitchen was a controlled frenzy. I kept my eyes on the line, my mind on the plates. We were in the zone, and the food leaving the past looked better than ever. The duck was perfectly seared, the handmade pastas had just the right bite. The desserts were plated like works of art. Each time a dish went out, I felt a surge of pride. This was what we were capable of. This was who we were. As the last table finished their meal, I finally let myself exhale. The service had been a success. The guests had been happy, the plates had come back empty, and the team looked exhausted but satisfied. I walked through the dining room after everyone had left, taking in the empty tables, and the faint smell of wine lingering in the air. It felt different tonight. The room seemed brighter, more alive, even though it was now empty. I thought about everything it had taken to get here, the long nights, the self-doubt, the moments when I'd wondered if it was worth it. And now, in this quiet, still moment, I knew it was. It wasn't just about the review. It was about knowing that all of that effort, all of that passion, had been worth something. That people saw it, felt it, tasted it. That my team had rallied around a shared vision and brought it to life. Before I left for the night, I stopped in the kitchen one last time. The lights were dim, the stainless steel surfaces gleaming from the cleanup. I placed my hands on the counter and took a deep breath. I could still hear Mike's voice in my head, reading those words, a hidden gem, redefining fine dining. It wasn't just about proving Isabel wrong anymore. It was about proving to myself that I belonged here, that this was the path I was meant to be on. As I walked out the back door and into the cool night air, I looked up at the stars and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Real, tangible hope. The kind that makes you stand a little taller, breathe a little easier. The kind that lets you look forward to the next day, the next service, the next step. I didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, I knew I was ready for it. Later that week, the buzz from the review hadn't died down. The phone rang constantly with reservation requests. People stopped me on the street, congratulating me, saying they'd heard about the Copper Spoon's transformation. It felt like the city's culinary scene had taken notice overnight. But with every call, every handshake, a small part of me wondered if Isabel had seen the review. I knew it wasn't healthy to keep thinking about her opinion, yet the thought lingered. If she'd read it, would she brush it off like everything else? Or would she finally understand that my work, my vision, had grown far beyond what she'd ever imagined? One afternoon, I was in the office going over inventory, when Mike poked his head in. "Chef," he said, his voice low, "you might want to come out here." "Something wrong?" I asked, already pushing back my chair. "Not wrong, just someone you'll want to see." I followed him out to the dining room, my stomach tightening. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual, just a few tables occupied by lunch guests. Soft conversation humming in the background. Then, near the corner, I saw her. Isabel. She was sitting alone at a small table, her back straight, her hands folded on the pristine white tablecloth. She wore the same calm, polished expression I remembered all too well. She didn't look up immediately. I watched as she glanced at the menu, then set it down carefully. She reached for her water glass, took a slow sip, and finally, her eyes met mine. For a second, I considered walking away, retreating to the kitchen where the heat and rhythm of service could drown out the awkwardness. But something held me in place. Maybe it was the way her gaze softened, just slightly, as if she wasn't quite sure what to say. I walked over, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached her table, I nodded. "Isabel." "John," she said simply, her tone unreadable. "Didn't expect to see you here," I said. My voice was steady, but my hands felt restless, as if they needed something to do. "What brings you by?" She hesitated, her lips pressing together for a moment. "I read the review." "Did you?" I asked, my tone carefully neutral. I didn't want to give away just how much her answer mattered, how much her reaction mattered. But inside, my heart was pounding. She nodded, glancing down at her water glass. "I did." There was a pause. I could hear the faint clink of silverware from another table, the muted laugh of a guest across the room. Isabel looked up again, and this time, her expression was different. Not smug, not dismissive, almost thoughtful. "It was well deserved," she said finally. Her words were measured, careful. "I mean it, John. What you've built here. It's impressive." It took me a moment to respond. I hadn't expected that. Not from her. "Thank you," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "I'll admit," she continued, her gaze steady now, "I didn't see it before. I didn't understand what you were trying to do. But after reading that, and hearing people talk about it." She trailed off, shaking her head slightly. "I get it now." I wanted to ask why she hadn't seen it before, why she'd dismissed it for so long. But I knew that wouldn't lead anywhere. Instead, I said, "I'm glad you came by. I hope you enjoy the food." Her lips curved into a faint smile. "I'm sure I will." I left her table, my mind racing. I returned to the kitchen, but it was hard to focus. The line cooks asked a few questions about the next service, and I answered automatically. My thoughts were still on Isabel, on what she'd said. Part of me wanted to let it go, to move on. The review, the recognition, had already validated the work. I didn't need her approval. I told myself that over and over. But her words, however brief, stayed with me. That night, as I closed up the restaurant, I thought about what it meant to be recognized by someone who had once dismissed me. It wasn't about revenge, or proving her wrong anymore. It was about closure. about finally putting that part of my life to rest. Isabel's words hadn't erased all the hurt, but they had given me something I didn't realize. I needed a chance to look forward without looking back. I locked the door, stepped out into the cool evening air, and let the sounds of the city wash over me. The lights of the restaurant reflected faintly in the windows across the street, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could walk away without carrying the weight of her disapproval. This was my place, my work, my life. And it was enough. In the days that followed, life at the Copper Spoon began to settle into a new rhythm. The steady stream of reservations kept the team sharp and focused, but it was more than that. The kitchen felt lighter somehow, more alive. The clatter of pans, and the rhythmic chop of knives, had always been music to my ears. But now there was an energy in the room that had been missing before. I could see it in the way Mike pushed the line cooks just a little harder, the way the servers moved through the dining room with a new sense of purpose. I even caught myself smiling more, not just out of satisfaction, but out of something deeper, a feeling that we'd finally found our stride. One evening, as I stood at the pass watching the team plate a round of entrees, I couldn't help but think back to that conversation with Isabel. Her words had surprised me. They were honest, unguarded in a way I wasn't used to from her. I wondered if she had walked away that day feeling the same strange mix of pride and regret that I felt. Part of me wanted to call her, to ask her what she really thought. But I knew better. That chapter was closed, and it was better left that way. Instead, I focused on the work. Each day brought new challenges, new opportunities to refine the menu, to push the limits of what we could do. I experimented with ingredients I'd never used before, incorporating hints of Southeast Asian flavors into classic French dishes, pairing unlikely combinations that forced me to think differently. It was exhilarating, and the guests noticed. They asked more questions, lingered longer at their tables. A few even requested to meet me after their meals. Each time, I stepped out into the dining room, shook their hands, and thanked them. But in the back of my mind, I still carried that memory of standing outside the baby shower, of being told there was no seat for me. It was a reminder of how far I'd come, of the distance between then and now. One night, after the last table had left and the staff had gone home, I sat alone in the dining room with a glass of wine. The soft glow of the candles reflected off the dark wood tables, and the faint scent of roasted garlic lingered in the air. I swirled the wine in my glass, staring at the empty seats, and thought about the people who had sat there over the years. Regulars who came in every Friday night, couples celebrating anniversaries, business people closing deals. I thought about the laughter, the quiet moments, the clinking of glasses. And then I thought about Isabel, and how she had once looked at me as if I didn't matter. That night in the dining room, I let myself feel the full weight of it, not just the hurt, but the triumph of having proven her wrong, of having built something she could no longer dismiss. As the days turned into weeks, I noticed a shift not just in the restaurant but in myself. I started to see the Copper Spoon for what it was, a reflection of my own journey, my own resilience. It wasn't just about the food or the accolades, it was about the people who worked here, the guests who came through our doors, and the countless hours we'd poured into making this place what it had become. It was about creating a space where everyone, from the dishwasher to the diners, felt like they belonged. I stopped worrying so much about what Isabel thought, stopped waiting for her approval. I realized I didn't need it anymore. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived. It was addressed to me in a familiar looping script. My stomach tightened as I opened it, unfolding the heavy, cream-colored paper. It was from Isabel. She wrote that she had been thinking a lot about our last conversation, about what she'd seen and felt at the restaurant that day. She admitted that she had underestimated me, that she hadn't understood what I was trying to build. And then she said something I never expected. She was proud of me. I stared at the letter for a long time, reading and rereading her words. Part of me wanted to dismiss it, to say it was too little, too late. But another part of me felt a strange sense of closure. I folded the letter carefully and set it aside. I didn't write back. I didn't need to. Her words, though unexpected, weren't the validation I'd been chasing all along. They were simply a reminder that I'd already found that validation within myself, within the walls of the Copper Spoon, within the people who believed in what we were doing here. That night, I walked through the empty dining room one more time before locking up. I ran my hand over the edge of the bar, felt the smooth wood under my palm, and took a deep breath. I thought about how much had changed. How much I had changed. The kitchen was quiet, the lights dim, and the city outside hummed softly in the background. I knew there would be more challenges ahead, more long nights, more moments of doubt, but I also knew that I was ready for them. I wasn't the same man who had stood outside that baby shower, unsure of where he fit in. I had found my place, not just in the restaurant but in my own life. As I stepped outside and locked the door, the cool night air wrapped around me. I looked up at the stars, took another deep breath, and smiled. The copper spoon was mine. It had been all along. I had built it with my own hands, my own vision, and that was enough. I walked away from the restaurant, not with the weight of the past, but with the quiet certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. You thought you knew how this would end, didn't you? But here's the twist. I didn't just win back my dignity. I built something they couldn't ignore. Something they couldn't laugh at anymore. So, what would you do in my situation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat. You won't believe what happened at my wife's baby shower. One moment I thought I was just another guest, and the next, I was left standing outside in disbelief. But that's not where the story ends. What I did next changed everything. Stick around, because by the end of this, you'll never look at betrayal the same way again.